Heraclon Publishing presents Dime Crime, Valentine for a Dead Lady, Mel D.Ames. Narrated by Mark Hebscher. A Matter of Observation. Room 804 at the Hotel Westmore harbored a grim pantomime of death. The nude body of a woman hung from a light fixture by the neck, and an overturned chair lay within kicking distance of a dainty pedicured foot. There was an eerie attitude to the body, to the limbs mostly, as they stood out a little from the perpendicular. It was as though death had come suddenly, in the throe of panic. The weight of the body on the thin leather belt from which it hung had pulled the light fixture partly away from the ceiling, and a few pieces of plaster were strewn on the dark pile of carpet. Some of the plaster fragments between the rungs of the overturned chair and beneath the body were scrunched deeply into the rug fibers. The room was furnished with the usual tiresome trappings peculiar to all second-rate hotels: bed, dresser, night table, a mate to the fallen chair, and a television set. The rapid flip-flopping of the TV screen gave a weird psychedelic aspect to the scene, and a tuneless rock group blaring from the FM band seemed only to fuel the illusion. Detective Lieutenant Cathy Carruthers stood in the open doorway, surveying the room with a cold, calculating eye. No sign of emotion, no feminine impropriety marred the composure of her finely wrought features. She was 6 feet from head to heel, blonde, and as she paced the hotel room in silent deliberation, she did things to a straight-cut gray business suit that had never been intended. And even though the garment ended mid-thigh, it fell well short of its given purpose, to subdue and otherwise divert attention from the superb body that moved within it. Her vital statistics had become classified information at Metro Central's 11th Precinct. Suicide? Detective Sergeant Mark Swanson regarded his partner with manly deference. The questioning tone in his voice had not been unintentional, though the fact seemed self-evident. Bitter experience had taught him to accept the obvious with caution. It had not been that way to begin with, but in recent months he had found many compensations working with the Amazon, an epithet that had been bestowed upon her with affection from her burly colleagues in homicide. Mark had felt no sense of umbrage in their gender disparity, nor was he fazed by the constant derision he endured at the hands of his macho cohorts. In addition to her obvious physical attributes, he had found his new partner to be a highly engaging individual and a detective of rare acumen. "Shall I cut her down, Lieutenant?" "Do that, Mark." Her smile was butter on his daily bread. "Use the same chair." Mark set the chair upright beside the hanging woman. The painted toes hung about an inch below the level of the seat. "With that kind of clearance," he said, "she'd have to stand on her tiptoes. A bit of a stretch, but certainly not impossible." Lieutenant Carruthers winced with womanly qualm as her partner mounted the chair, sinking his feet deep into the well-upholstered cushion with typical masculine indifference, she thought, but then returned her attention to the dead woman as he parted the thin leather belt that held her and lowered her gently to the floor. She had been pretty once, about mid-20s with short dark hair and a good figure. Now her face was a purple horror. The lieutenant knelt beside the body and drew a few strands of tightly curled hair from one clenched fist. "Could be her own," Mark observed over her shoulder. The lieutenant turned contemplative eyes upon him that temporarily took his mind off his work. This was one of the compensations. "Take a sheet from the bed and cover her," she said demurely, slipping the hair samples into a small white envelope, then into her jacket pocket. A little man with black hair and swarthy features came into the room. "My name's Forbes," he said curtly. "I am the hotel manager." He leveled his words at Mark, who, busy with the sheet, directed him with a nod to the head of his imposing colleague. "Thank you for coming," said the lieutenant pleasantly. "I should like to ask you a few questions." The little man turned his head from one to the other, unable to decide where his obeisance lay. Cathy Carruthers had long since resigned herself to this hesitancy on the part of some men in accepting her, a woman, in what they considered a man's domain. But precious few hesitated for long. "What was the woman's name?" she asked with practical authority. "Valerie Smith," replied the hotel man. "Miss?" "Yes, at least that's how she registered." "And when might that have been?" "Yesterday evening, around 7. Forbes squirmed nervously. "Have you seen her before, Mr. Forbes?" "No. Well, I mean, this wasn't her first time to stay at the hotel. Yes, I'd seen her before." "But you were not acquainted with her?" "No." "Do you know anyone who was?" "No, I don't." The lieutenant gave him a searching look. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me? No, except I don't see what you're making all the fuss about. The creature obviously took her own life. What makes you say that? Well, for one thing, we had to break in this morning. Both doors to this room were bolted from the inside, and the transom. The window is almost 100 feet off the ground, no ledges or balconies. I'm no detective, ma'am, but that adds up to suicide in any man's language. Yes, Mr. Forbes, I agree, Cathy Carruthers said sweetly. You are not a detective because, you see, I am, and it's quite obvious to me that this woman was murdered. Mark cast an inquiring glance at his superior. He knew from past experience that this was no idle speculation. Now, perhaps you can tell me, Mr. Forbes, who was the first to find her? Forbes was visibly disconcerted. One of the maids, I believe, Mrs. Grebsky. Is she in the hotel now? Yes. Forbes raised his eyes in an attitude of reflection. Shall I send for her? Please do. And Mr. Forbes, before you go, the lieutenant was standing by the door to the hall, and she drew the man's attention to the light switch on the wall. It was the type with two flat surfaces that you push rather than flick, and on the lower off switch was a fingerprint so clearly visible that it seemed almost to have been put there intentionally. You will notice, the lieutenant told him, that someone has left their calling card. That is, if you can remember with certainty whether or not anyone else has used this switch. Yes, Forbes said quickly, I do. I mean, it was me. The light was on, so I turned it off. Force of habit, I guess. That was this morning when you found the girl? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Forbes. As the hotel man left, the lieutenant answered her assistant's unspoken query with an audacious wink. Then, with one blood-red fingernail, she pushed the on surface of the switch and looked up at the broken fixture. The bulb did not respond. What do you make of that? Must be a short in the fixture. Must be, agreed the Amazon, absently. Mark withdrew the bulb from its socket and tried it in the lamp on the night table. This time it lit up. Success, he said. But as he turned, he found himself to be alone in his conclusions, however illuminating. The lieutenant was already deeply engrossed in a new line of contemplation. Let us consider the dilemma of the doors, she mused aloud. There were two. One door opened out into the hall, the other to an adjoining room. The hall door, she noticed, had a night latch and the customary hotel night chain, which now hung broken and useless from the door jamb. The other door, which connected to room 806, had a common slide bolt with a projecting knob that fell as it was moved forward into a notched locking slot. There was also a locking slot at the other end of the bolt housing, which engaged the knob when the bolt was in the open position. The lieutenant tested the easy action of the bolt, then withdrew it and tried the door. It was apparently locked from the other side. Mark, close at her elbow, had been running parallel with her observations until she stooped to retrieve a toothpick from the floor carpet. And here he lost contact in a flash of an Amazonian leg. Interesting, mused the lieutenant, toothpick held twixt thumb and forefinger. Very, said Mark with some ambiguity. When she straightened, Forbes was standing in the hall doorway. He ushered in a middle-aged, nondescript sort of woman in a blue thin-striped uniform. This is Mrs. Grebsky, Lieutenant. She was the one who found her. Thank you, Mr. Forbes. The lieutenant turned compelling eyes upon her assistant. Mark, while I'm talking to Mrs. Grebsky, would you endeavor to open this connecting door from the other side? Perhaps Mr. Forbes would assist you. I should like to have a look at the other room. Sam Morton, coroner and chief medical examiner, MCPD, took that precise moment to arrive, followed closely by photographers and lab men. The lieutenant guided Mrs. Grebsky to a spot by the window, out of the ensuing chaos. Mrs. Grebsky, do you remember what time it was when you found her? Mrs. Grebsky had the look of a frightened child. Yes, sir, ma'am, but 7:45, I'd say. What made you investigate so early? 8:04 had an early call, ma'am. I thought the room would be empty. I see. Now, tell me what happened. I knocked first, ma'am, then used the passkey. The door wouldn't open a few inches because of the night chain, but I could still see inside. She shuddered. It was horrible. What did you do then? I screamed, she said, looking as though she intended to again. Then I went for Mr. Forbes. And Mr. Forbes broke the door in? The lieutenant filled in for her, saw that she was long dead, and called us. That's right, ma'am. Mrs. Grebsky, did you follow Mr. Forbes into the room? No, ma'am, not likely. Did anyone? No, ma'am. You're sure of that? Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Mrs. Grebsky. You may go. As the maid stepped gingerly around the luckless Miss Smith on her way to the door, the medical examiner looked up to see the top half of Lieutenant Cathy Carruthers disappearing out the open window. She was prevented from disappearing entirely only by the tender balance of the remaining half, which he regarded with unprofessional interest, as it maneuvered her way through the examination of the window's exterior and an exquisite re-entry. Intriguing, she mused, regaining her lofty stature with a toss of her blonde head. Very, Sam Morton agreed, averting his eyes. Sam, she favored him with a disarming smile. You've something to tell me? Nothing you don't already know, Lieutenant. Strangulation? Yes. Can you pin the time down? You want an educated guess? In the absence of anything better, yes. I'd say 6 to 8 hours. Was the neck broken? I think not. That was something I didn't know, Sam. Thank you. Mark came through the connecting door just as Valerie Smith was being borne horizontally out the other. He found the lieutenant inspecting the contents of the dead woman's overnight bag. The bag looked as though it had been rifled. Has this been disturbed? Asked the lieutenant. Not prior to your arrival, Mr. Forbes volunteered from the doorway. And these? She indicated some clothing that hung in a doorless alcove, serving as a clothes closet. A gaily patterned dress, a slip, and a 3/4 coat. The coat was beltless, but the leather trim on the collar matched the belt that had circled the pretty neck of Valerie Smith. The hotel man shook his head. Not to my knowledge, he said. Mr. Forbes, the lieutenant favored him with a long look. I wonder if you would get me the name of the person, if any, who occupied room 806 last night. I already have that information, Lieutenant, said Mark. It was a Mr. Wilson Greaves, sales representative from out of town, in plastics, or so the register says. 50-ish, 150 pounds, 5'6", and bald as a billiard ball. Booked in about 11 p.m. and left with the night owl. What time did the night owl leave? The night clerk saw a man answering Greaves' description leave the hotel just after midnight, about 12:15. And incidentally, both rooms were arranged for a day ahead, simultaneously, by someone who identified herself as Greaves' secretary. Thank you, Mark. She projected a just reward. Now, let's have a look at this other room. In the open doorway, the lieutenant stopped to trace a barely distinguishable line with her fingertips across the varnished surface of the door jamb. There was an identical mark on the now accessible edge of the open door. By closing the door, she was able to bring the lines together. Both marks were the same approximate height as the bolt in 804. Has this room been cleaned yet, Mr. Forbes? Not yet. The bed showed no sign of having been slept in, and there was no luggage or clothing or any sign of occupancy. A door key stamped 806 was on the bureau. And the door to the hall, Mr. Forbes, was it locked when you came through just now? Yes, it was. I used my pass key. Good. Mark, see if you can't find traces of burning in that metal wastebasket. I'll check the bathroom. Under the lip of the toilet bowl, the lieutenant found several irregular pieces of ash residue. She was slipping them into a white envelope when Mark came in holding up a blackened hand. Somebody's burned something in there, he said. But how did you know? I didn't, she smiled, but I do now. She continued to poke around the room until a seascape above a bed caught her eye. It was slightly askew, and she straightened it. A half-inch strip immediately below the picture was noticeably lighter than the surrounding wall. Mark, said the lieutenant without a smile, I want you to put out on all points on Mr. Wilson Greaves. I'm afraid we shall have to detain that gentleman for questioning. She stopped on her way out the door and turned, and as though on second thought, she added, And Mr. Forbes, we shall want you as well. Me? Want me? Forbes was livid. For what? The lieutenant spoke softly with a forced calm. The part you have played in this affair, Mr. Forbes, poses no mystery for me. Your bungling, obvious attempts to hide one crime has implicated you in another. I am in doubt at this point only as to why. Mark's look of amazement was paralleled by the show of utter disbelief on the face of the hotel manager, and he wondered if he would ever have enough answers of his own to withstand the initial impact of these oracular bombshells. But when the dust had settled, there were only questions still. Before he could put voice to them, the Amazon was fast disappearing down the hall. Lieutenant Cathy Carruthers sat atop her desk in the squad room, adorning her fingernails with a fresh coating of blood-red lacquer. Behind his own desk, Mark Swanson had propped his feet on an open drawer and was regarding his attractive colleague with mild chagrin. "Okay," he said, "give—" The lieutenant smiled, sphinx-like. "A simple matter of observation," she said lightly. She crossed one majestic leg over the other, contributing nothing to local jurisprudence. "Outmaneuvered again," muttered Mark. "To begin with," began the lieutenant, "let's examine the unlikely premise that Valerie Smith committed suicide. Frankly, Mark, I thought it inconceivable that any woman, and a vain one in particular, did you notice those pedicured toes, would deliberately suffer the indignity of being found stark naked and at the same time so horribly visaged. Dead, yes. Dead and naked, perhaps. Repugnantly dead and or naked? No. There was just no point in it. I thought it more likely she had worn a nightie or a slip of some sort, that it was perhaps torn during a struggle and subsequently removed from the scene, as not in keeping with the suicide idea." Said Mark. "Then again, it appeared to me most inconsistent that a person sufficiently disturbed as to contemplate the act of suicide would switch on a television for a little viewing beforehand. I'm more inclined to think that the television was used to cover the sounds of struggle, and whomever, after doing her in, so to speak, simply neglected to turn off the set." "Logical," said Mark, "but hardly conclusive. Surely you had more to go on than that when you told Forbes we had a murderer on our hands. Not conclusive?" The lieutenant held up a red-tipped hand for inspection, her blonde head tilted appraisingly. "To a man, perhaps. Honestly, Mark, sometimes the lack of insight in you men astounds me. But then women are built so differently, aren't they?" Mark conceded silently and with appropriation. "Besides, it was physically impossible for Valerie Smith to have hanged herself from that chair." "What? But I measured—" "I know," said the lieutenant, beginning now to paint the nails on the other hand, "but only after the body had hung there for some time, and the leather belt that held her had been given time to stretch. Leather stretches frightfully, you know, and if you remember, the light fixture was pulled down away from the ceiling somewhat, which would tend to widen the gap still further, inasmuch as it was higher than its original position. Then, too, the weight of her body, if she had stood on the chair, would have depressed the upholstered seat by 2 or 3 inches. There just wasn't sufficient margin to accommodate any of those factors, never mind all of them." The lieutenant hung her nails up to dry, wrists limp, hands high. "One more thing," she said. "There were pieces of well-trampled plaster that had broken away from the ceiling when the light fixture was pulled from its fastenings, littered all over the floor below the body and the overturned chair, where the feet of Valerie Smith would not have stood, due to them being suspended in mid-air before the plaster had fallen, and where no other feet save for those of her hangman could have stood, and then only prior to or simultaneous with the staging of that gruesome little charade, bolted doors and all, that subsequently greeted Mrs. Grebsky, Mr. Forbes, and our unhappy selves, in that precise order. So you see, Mark, the suicide supposition would appear to have very little left to support it." Mark lit a cigarette. "If she didn't hang herself, then how do you suggest someone went about staging a private necktie party on the 8th floor of a busy hotel in the middle of the city? It seems to me—" "I strongly suggest," the lieutenant put in serenely, "that she was hung there by a person or persons yet unknown. Recall now, from your anatomical studies at the police academy, the relative strength of a woman's neck in relation to her body weight is such that even a short drop of this kind would normally break it. I say normally because it is not inevitable, just probable. But Valerie Smith's neck was not broken. She died of strangulation. Not conclusive, mind you, not in itself, but every substantiating clue serves to strengthen the premise as a whole. Don't you agree?" Before Mark could respond, agreeably or otherwise, the telephone jangled with sudden alarm. The lieutenant tilted on her ample axis and reached for it, stretched over the desktop with the fluid grace of a panther. This was no longer employment, Mark told himself. It was a form of entertainment. "Lieutenant Carruthers here." She listened for a moment and then said, "Fine. Have them bring him up when they get in. And, Sergeant, would you send an escort for Forbes?" "Yes. We're holding him now. I'd like him here when we talk to Greaves." The sound of the sergeant's voice crackled discordantly through the receiver, and with a show of agitation, she held the instrument away from her ear. When she could get a word in, she said, "Sergeant, I'll sign it when I come by the desk." "Right, and while you're at it, see if you can chase up those reports from the coroner's office." "No, and I still haven't heard from lab or records." "As you say, Sergeant." When she had replaced the instrument and regained her equilibrium, she said, "Men." Mark said, "So, they've got Graves?" "Yes, and I've got hunger pangs." She looked at her watch. "How about some lunch?" "Thought you'd never ask. Let's try Lil Ollie's. It's close and it's quick." "Match for the damage?" The lieutenant shook her golden head. "Dutch?" "Dutch." On the street, Cathy Carruthers walked tall and tempered at his side, with a naked animal's stealth that made Mark astutely aware of the almost awesome intelligence and strength possessed by this amazing woman. Seated across from Cathy Carruthers at Lil Ollie's cafeteria, Mark was aware that he was sheltering a callow sense of pride, a feeling of outright resentment, and a thin disguise of professional pedantry. Pride in his somewhat role of escort to the magnificent Amazon, resentment in the endless turning of male heads, and the inevitable ogling. To suppress any such activity, he knew, would require an exercise that would be tantamount to the total arrestment of crime itself. He allowed his mind to wander these avenues for a time, until wild conjecture carried him into the nightmare of such outlandish fancy that he was happy at length to turn his thoughts back to the only somewhat less untenable complicacies surrounding the demise of Valerie Smith. With a hot corned beef sandwich under his belt and a cup of coffee warming his palate, Mark began to feel a little less like a student cadet at the police academy. "Okay," he said, with a sigh of resignation, "so Valerie Smith did not take her own life. Then what explanation do you have for this business of the locked room?" The lieutenant sipped thoughtfully on a glass of milk. "Well, once we had ruled out the possibility of suicide, it followed categorically that someone had come and gone through one of the two locked doors, or an 8-story window. Of the three, the connecting door seemed to me the least formidable. That was where I found the toothpick, remember, directly beneath the bolt, which, incidentally, gave me my first clue as to how it was accomplished." "Do tell," said Mark. "If you recall, the bolt housing had a notched locking slot that engaged the projected knob, by the simple expedient of gravity, in both the locked and the open position. It was to offset this gravitational action that the toothpick, presumably, had been inserted between the bolt and the housing, thereby preventing the bolt from revolving and the projecting knob from dropping into the locking slot. This would permit the bolt, while still in the open position, to be drawn forward by whatever means without interception. Once released, the toothpick would simply fall to the floor. I'm with you, Lieutenant. A common piece of string could have done it, one end tied to the knob on the bolt, the other passed around the end of the door. Then, with the door closed, the string could have been manipulated from 806. Exactly, said the lieutenant, adding impishly, but then, how would you dispose of the string? Yeah, how? It puzzled me, too, until I spotted the seascape in 806. The painting had obviously been disturbed, taken down, in fact, and the picture wire removed, then hurriedly replaced so that the frame rested higher on the wall than before. This, you remember, was not noticeable while the picture was askew, but only after I had straightened it, which was probably why it was overlooked. The wire, of course, made a perfect tool with which to draw the bolt. A wide, non-slip loop would have easily moved the bolt horizontally, then, when slackened, would tend to spring away from the knob, allowing it to fall of its own accord into the locking slot. The wire could then be drawn back into the other room and replaced. I suspect the end of the wire, twisted to effect the loop, was responsible for the light scratches on the edge of the door and the door jamb. And I suspect you're right, said Mark. He followed her with unhidden eyes as she deserted her chair long enough to acquire a second glass of milk. He sighed. The Amazon in repose was disturbing enough. In motion, she was mesmeric. I will admit, though, she said, on resuming her seat, I did not expect Greaves to be bald, as a billiard ball, you said, which was worse still. After all, Greaves had to be our prime suspect. It meant the hair we found in Valerie Smith's clenched fist could not have come from him, at least not from his head. In view of this, I permitted myself the somewhat improbable supposition that Mr. Greaves was still haired below the neck, if not above it. Purely an assumption, you understand, but still, the hair sample did more closely resemble body hair than of the scalp variety. And if it were so, Greaves being our culprit, it would